Good morning. Today we are going to talk about blood supply of cerebral area or cerebral hemisphere of brain. So we should remember that here we are going to understand about the circle of Willis, then their branches, how it is made up of, then some landmarks, and then perfusion territories of these vessels. So first of all, we have to understand vertebral basilar system. As you can see the name, it says vertebral. So you can recall that brain system is supplied with the blood by a network of arteries collectively called as vertebral basilar system. This system actually arises from vertebral arteries. You can simply identify vertebral arteries when you see the cervical vertebrae, and from their foramen, the transversus foramen, arteries move upside. That artery is called as vertebral artery, and which is actually the branch of subclavian artery. Subclavian artery gives 5 branches, which can be acronized as VIT-CT, vitamin CT. So V here is for vertebral artery. So this particular part will go from back side and then it will take part in the circle of Willis. You can see the names here clearly. These are the vertebral arteries. Here it is the subclavian artery, and then they will move upside to form the basilar artery, and this system will be called as vertebral basilar system. Next, we have to see from the anterior side. So anterior side, on comparison, the cortex and deep structures are supplied with the blood supply from the anterior arterial system, basically from the internal carotid arteries. So you can recall that there was common carotid artery which were divided into internal carotid and external carotid. External carotid give 8 branches, and they were basically for the face and other parts which were not going in the brain. But internal carotid will go inside the cerebral part, and then it will take part in the circle of Willis. So you can see here this anterior system anastomosis with the posterior vertebral basilar artery at the circle, cerebral arterial circle. The cerebral arterial circle creates a collateral flow which can be protective in the case which one of part of the system becomes compromised. If something happens to one of the branches, then it will be compensated by the other branches. But here one point has to be noted that anatomical variations in the cerebral arterial circle is very common, with only 34% of individual displaying a complete classical cycle. Means most of the people are not having the complete cycle, but it will be there in some parts. So here you can see it is a cerebral arterial cycle, this part. Then there will be brain stem will start like midbrain, pons, and medulla, and that will be supplied by the vertebral basilar system. Further, how can we summarize this? So basilar artery, which is supplied by the vertebral arteries from posterior side, bifurcate to form the posterior cerebral arteries. Remember the names, posterior cerebral artery. You can see this is basilar artery, which was formed by the vertebral artery, and then it will form the posterior cerebral artery. The internal carotid arteries supplied by the common carotid arteries supply the middle cerebral arteries and anterior cerebral. The middle and cerebral will be formed from the anterior system. So you can see here, this is anterior carotid artery, middle cerebral artery, and anterior cerebral artery. The anterior system joins with the vertebral basilar system through the posterior communicating arteries, forming the circle beginning. Then you can see here, these are the posterior communicating arteries. This is how a circle is completed. The cerebral arterial circle is completed through the connections between the anterior cerebral arteries accomplished by the anterior communicating artery. So there will be one more anterior communicating artery, and then ultimately you can see this whole thing will be called a circle of Willis. Next, you can see a dissected part. So here also you can see that there will be anterior carotid artery, this part, then middle cerebral artery which goes to the medial part, posterior cerebral artery coming from the posterior side, that is from the vertebral basilar system, then posterior communicating artery. This will part one side of the circle of Willis. The anterior cerebral artery is not visible here, and anterior communicating artery also not visible here, but these 4 can be seen from this particular specimen. Now talking about in detail about the posterior cerebral artery, where it is going to give supply, what will the problem. So posterior cerebral artery arises from basilar artery. You can recall they are connected to internal carotid via posterior communicating arteries. So you can see this is basilar artery followed from the vertebral artery. From here there will be posterior cerebral artery, and then they will be connected with the posterior communicating artery to the anterior part. So this will be the posterior cerebral artery summary. If you see the specimen part, the posterior cerebral artery curves around the midbrain on their way to the cortex. The posterior cerebral artery sends branches over the inferior and medial temporal lobes as well as medial occipital lobe. So basically, we understand whatever is the posterior side, like occipital and temporal lobes, will be supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Here you can see this is posterior cerebral artery, and this is the perfusion area where it is going to give the supply. The posterior cerebral artery supplies the portions of midbrain also. So some part of midbrain will be also supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. At the cortex, the posterior cerebral artery supplies, as we have already talked, medial surface of both occipital and temporal lobe, inferior and medial surface of temporal lobe, and some portion of lateral temporal and occipital lobe. You can simply summarize most of the part of occipital and temporal bones. Then there will be some deep branches which will also supply the thalamus part. So thalamus part will be also supplied by the some of the deep branches. You see this is the part. This will be also supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Next, we will talk about the middle cerebral artery. Middle cerebral artery will be a direct branch of internal carotid artery, at which we have already talked. You can see here, this is middle cerebral artery and coming from the internal carotid artery. So how can we see it in the specimen? So MCA curves to enter the lateral fissure where it then divides into the multiple end branches. MCA, that is middle cerebral artery, generally bifurcates into two divisions. However, they are highly variable and maybe four also can be found. The MCA division forms the loops as they travel over the insula and then exit the lateral fissure and pass onto the lateral surface of the cortex. So you can understand this will be mostly towards the lateral surface or the medial surfaces of the nerve. So this is how the area of the middle cerebral artery will be there. We'll talk in detail about territories. So as it exits to the lateral fissure, the superior division supplies the portion of frontal and parietal cortex. Above this region, fissure, the inferior division supplies the temporal and parietal cortex below this fissure. It also supplies the small area of the inferior surface of frontal lobe as well as deep structures, which will be decided in the next part like this. So the lenticulo-striate arteries are the deep branches. Remember the name, lenticulo-striate arteries are the deep branches of MCA. They supply the last portion of the basal ganglia and internal capsule, which are the most important parts for the fibers, descending or ascending fibers. So you can see this is MCA territory, and this is the territory especially for the deep branch, that is caudate nucleus, internal capsule, putamen, and globus pallidus. They are summarized like a basal ganglia and internal capsule part. Then coming to the anterior cerebral artery, so it is also coming from directly from the internal carotid artery. There are two anterior cerebral arteries which anastomose at the anterior communicating arteries. You can see anterior cerebral artery and anterior communicating arteries. So if you see in the specimen, the ACA passes anterior to enter into the longitudinal fissure. MCA किसमें गया था? Lateral fissure. Then swings posterior to travel along the superior surface of corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is joining part. This part is corpus callosum. The ACA generally bifurcates into two branches on the medial surface of the brain. So here you can see the anterior cerebral artery. What is the perfusion area? So it mostly supplies the medial surface. देखो नाम medial artery था पर वो medial को supply नहीं कर रहा था. Here anterior will be supply most of the medial surface of frontal and parietal lobe. Also supply the inferior surfaces of frontal lobe, and end arteries are also going to supply to the lateral surface of frontal and parietal. So mostly frontal and parietal lobe will be supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Then you can, if you want to see the territory, so basically it will be towards the corpus callosum and frontal parts. Then there is the anterior choroidal artery. It travels to the choroidal plexuses in the lateral ventricles. Their perfusion territory includes the deep structures located into the temporal and occipital lobe, which includes the portion of globus pallidus, putamen, tail of caudate nucleus, posterior limb of internal capsule and hippocampus. The anterior choroidal artery is small in diameter, however, it branches off the large and high pressure internal carotid artery. This leaves is vulnerable to increase in the blood pressure, which can lead to the bursting of the small arteries or causing the hemorrhage stroke. So you can see this is internal carotid artery and this is anterior choroidal artery. The anterior choroidal artery is basically for the traveling into the choroidal plexus in lateral ventricle. Then there's some deep structures which is going to give supply, some part of the basal ganglia and some part of the hippocampus internal capsule also. And if something happens to this, then blood pressure will be rise and it will occur into the hemorrhagic stroke. So anterior choroidal, what are the perfusion arteries? So this is the total for the hippocampus, lateral ventricle, globus pallidus, and internal capsule posterior. So this area will be supplied by the anterior choroidal artery. Now, what are watershed areas? So arteries supplying the forebrain are actually the end arteries, and there is very little overlap between the perfusion territories. The area where two perfusion territories come together is called watershed area. This watershed area are the vulnerable to the severe drop in systemic blood pressure as well as during the partial population of major vessels, resulting in decreased perfusion. So watershed area वो area जहाँ पे दो perfusion territory एक साथ पास में आ जाते हैं, and they are very dangerous because if there is some blood pressure loss in systemic blood pressure, then there will be also some problem in this particular area. So examples are like ACA territory, MCA territory kind example, PCA means these are the three basic cerebral arteries. Then you can see now watershed area. This is the first watershed area in between the anterior and middle, and then you can see one more watershed area in between the middle and posterior. Next, we can talk about the blood supply of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is actually the part of small subcortical nuclei within the brain and are responsible for the motor control. So they are made up of caudate, thalamus, putamen, and globus pallidus. You can see the caudate is shown by the yellow color, then putamen by red, blue, thalamus, and globus pallidus is a small part with the in the slide. You can see the version. Now, talking about the blood supply. So you can see ACA is basically supplying to the anterior part of both the nucleuses. Then MCA is the most of the part. PCA will be for the posterior part, and anterior choroidal will supply also to the posterior part only. So forming some watershed area here also. So that's all for the supply of the blood to the brain in the very short and lucid manner. You have to remember from where the branches are going to be formed and which area they are going to be perfusing. Thank you. Thank you very much.